The fluorescent lights of Urban Defense Academy cast harsh shadows across the polished concrete floor as Margaret Chen adjusted her oversized sweatshirt for the third time in 5 minutes. At 62, with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing worn sneakers that had seen better days, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong building entirely. The Martial Arts Academy buzzed with the controlled aggression of serious practitioners, their movements sharp and precise as they warmed up with practice drills that spoke of years of dedicated training. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret clutched her enrollment paperwork with fingers that bore the calluses of a lifetime spent working in her small neighborhood bakery. The forms identified her as a complete beginner seeking basic self-defense skills, which was technically true though not remotely complete. Her reason for joining was listed as personal safety concerns, which again contained fragments of truth wrapped around a much more complex reality that she had no intention of sharing with strangers. The other students in the knife defense class represented a cross-section of serious martial artists and dedicated fitness enthusiasts. There was Derek Morrison, a corporate security consultant whose expensive tactical gear and confident posture marked him as someone who took his training very seriously. Jessica Wang, a former military police officer whose precise movements and alert eyes suggested someone who had faced real danger in her professional life. Robert Castellanos, an emergency room doctor who had seen too many knife wounds and wanted to ensure he never became a victim himself. All of them were decades younger than Margaret, visibly fit, and carried themselves with the kind of physical confidence that came from regular training and competitive athletics. When Margaret entered their training circle, the contrast was so stark that several students exchanged glances that mixed curiosity with barely concealed amusement. Instructor Marcus Rivera had built his reputation over 15 years of teaching practical combat skills to law enforcement, military personnel, and serious civilian students. His background included tours as a Marine Corps combat instructor and extensive training in Filipino martial arts that emphasized knife fighting techniques. The Academy's walls displayed photographs of his competition victories and certificates from internationally recognized martial arts organizations, establishing his credentials as someone who understood violence in both theoretical and practical terms. Rivera's initial assessment of Margaret was swift and dismissive. His experienced eye cataloged her obvious physical limitations, her apparent lack of athletic background, and her nervous demeanor that suggested someone who had never faced physical confrontation. In his professional judgment, she represented exactly the kind of student who would benefit from basic awareness training and simple escape techniques rather than advanced combat skills. "Welcome to Advanced Knife Defense," Rivera announced to the assembled class, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate respect. "This course focuses on practical techniques for surviving edged weapon encounters in real-world situations. The training is physically demanding and psychologically challenging. Students who are not prepared for intensive contact should consider our basic self-defense offerings instead." His glance toward Margaret was brief but unmistakable, suggesting that his recommendation applied particularly to certain members of the current class. Several students noticed the look and understood the implication, though Margaret's expression remained neutral as she absorbed both the instruction and the subtle dismissal. The warm-up exercises revealed the fitness gap that Rivera had anticipated. While younger students moved through combat drills with fluid athleticism, Margaret's movements appeared careful and measured, as though she was protecting joints that complained about sudden demands. Her stretching routine looked like that of someone managing chronic stiffness, and her breathing during cardio exercises suggested cardiovascular limitations that would become problematic during intensive training. Derek Morrison, warming up nearby, watched Margaret's struggles with the mixture of sympathy and superiority that Fit athletes often felt toward those who were clearly out of their element. "First time taking a martial arts class?" he asked with condescending kindness, his tone suggesting someone offering encouragement to a child attempting adult activities. "Something like that," Margaret replied quietly, her voice carrying the humble uncertainty of someone acknowledging their obvious limitations. She continued her careful stretching routine while around her, more experienced students demonstrated their familiarity with complex, warm-up sequences that prepared their bodies for the physical demands of knife defense training. The basic instruction phase showcased just how far behind Margaret was compared to her classmates. Rivera demonstrated fundamental knife grips, attack angles, and defensive positioning using terminology and concepts that the other students absorbed with the quick comprehension of people who had been training in martial arts for years. Margaret's questions revealed unfamiliarity with basic concepts that everyone else took for granted. "Instructor Rivera," Margaret asked during a discussion of blade presentation angles, "when you refer to the outside line, could you explain what that means in practical terms?" Her question was reasonable for a complete beginner, but it highlighted the knowledge gap between her and students who were discussing advanced technical concepts with casual familiarity. Jessica Wang, practicing nearby combinations with smooth precision, couldn't help but notice how Margaret struggled with even the most basic defensive positions. "The outside line refers to attacks coming from your opponent's weapon side," she explained helpfully, though her tone carried the patient condescension of an expert addressing someone who clearly lacked fundamental knowledge. Rivera's demonstration of proper stance and footwork revealed additional limitations in Margaret's apparent abilities. While other students automatically adjusted their positioning to optimize balance and mobility, Margaret's movements looked uncertain and awkward, as though she was trying to remember instructions rather than executing trained responses. Her footwork lacked the smooth transitions that marked experienced martial artists, and her hand positioning suggested someone who had never held a training knife before. The partner drills that followed were where Margaret's limitations became most apparent, and where the other students' growing impatience began to show. Rivera paired students for controlled exercises that required precise timing and mutual trust, fundamental skills that developed through consistent practice. Margaret was partnered with different classmates throughout the session, and each pairing highlighted her inexperience in ways that disrupted the training rhythm. Working with Derek, Margaret's slow reactions and uncertain movements made it impossible for him to practice his combinations at proper speed. "You need to respond faster to the attack presentation," he explained with growing frustration, his words carrying the edge that serious athletes develop when their training is compromised by less skilled partners. "In a real situation, hesitation will get you killed." Margaret nodded apologetically and attempted to increase her response speed, but her movements remained careful and measured, as though she was processing each defensive option instead of reacting with trained reflexes. Derek's combination drills, which should have been smooth exchanges that built muscle memory and tactical understanding, became choppy sequences interrupted by Margaret's need to think through each response. Rivera observed these interactions with growing concern that his class structure was being compromised by a student whose skill level was inappropriate for the advanced material being covered. His other students were accomplished martial artists who had enrolled specifically for high-level technical instruction, and Margaret's presence was preventing them from achieving their training objectives. The situation reached its breaking point during a complex drill that required students to defend against multiple attack angles while maintaining proper distance and positioning. Rivera demonstrated the technique with Jessica, their movements flowing with the precision that came from years of training and mutual understanding of advanced concepts. The exercise required split-second timing, precise footwork, and the kind of spatial awareness that develops only through extensive practice. When it was Margaret's turn to attempt the drill with Robert, the result was predictably awkward. Her defensive positioning was incorrect, her timing was off, and her movement patterns showed none of the flowing transitions that the technique required. Robert, attempting to be patient, repeatedly stopped the drill to offer corrections, but Margaret's fundamental unfamiliarity with the underlying concepts made meaningful progress impossible. "Mrs. Chun," Rivera interrupted, his professional patience finally reaching its limit. "This particular technique requires foundation skills that take months to develop properly. Perhaps you would benefit more from our basic personal safety course, which covers awareness and escape techniques more appropriate for beginning students." The suggestion was delivered with professional courtesy, but everyone in the room understood that Rivera was essentially asking Margaret to leave the advanced class. The other students watched with the mixture of sympathy and relief that experienced practitioners feel when training disruptions are addressed, though some faces showed the particular satisfaction that comes with seeing someone who clearly didn't belong finally being asked to leave. Margaret's response was quiet but firm, delivered with a dignity that surprised several observers. "I understand that I'm behind the other students in terms of recent training, Instructor Rivera. However, I paid for this course, and I'd like to continue if possible. Perhaps I could work on modified versions of the techniques until I catch up to the class level." Rivera's expression showed the particular frustration of an instructor whose professional recommendation was being challenged by someone who clearly lacked the expertise to make informed judgments about training appropriateness. "Mrs. Chun, knife defense requires physical capabilities and reflexes that develop through years of preparation. This isn't a matter of catching up through extra effort. Some techniques require attributes that can't be developed quickly." Derek Morrison, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with the disruptions to his training, chose this moment to voice what several students had been thinking. "Look, no offense, but maybe you should start with something more realistic for your situation. There are senior fitness classes that might be more appropriate." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The comment was delivered with a laugh that carried just enough cruelty to make clear that Derek's patience with political correctness had been exhausted by repeated interruptions to his training. Several other students joined the laughter, their amusement fed by the release of tension that had been building throughout the session as Margaret's limitations became increasingly apparent. Jessica Wang, attempting to soften Derek's bluntness while still supporting his underlying message, added her own perspective with the tone of someone offering reasonable advice to someone who clearly needed guidance. "What Derek means is that knife defense is extremely demanding physically and mentally. Most people train for years before attempting the techniques we're covering today. There's no shame in starting with basics and working your way up." Rivera seized on this support from his more experienced students to reinforce his professional recommendation with additional authority. "Mrs. Chun, I've been teaching martial arts for 15 years, and I can tell you that attempting advanced techniques without proper preparation is not only ineffective, it's dangerous. The basic personal safety course would give you practical skills that you could actually use, rather than techniques that require capabilities you simply don't possess." The circle of students around Margaret had grown as the discussion continued, their body language expressing a mixture of impatience, condescension, and growing amusement at what was becoming an increasingly awkward situation. Margaret stood in the center of this circle, her oversized sweatshirt and worn sneakers making her appear even more out of place among the athletic figures surrounding her. Robert Castellanos, drawing on his medical background, offered what he considered a clinical assessment of the situation. From a physiological perspective, reflexes and reaction time decline significantly with age. The neural pathways required for complex combat techniques simply don't function as efficiently in older adults. This isn't personal, it's just biology. The laughter that followed Robert's clinical explanation was more widespread and cruel. as students interpreted his medical authority as scientific confirmation of what they had been observing throughout the session. Margaret's obvious physical limitations, her slow learning pace, and her disruption of their training had been validated by professional expertise, giving them permission to express their frustration more openly. The humiliation reached its peak when Rivera decided to demonstrate the gap between Margaret's current abilities and the class requirements through a controlled exercise that would make his point definitively. "Mrs. Chun, let's try a simple demonstration. Derek will present a basic knife attack at quarter speed, and you attempt the defense we've been practicing. This will show you the difference between understanding a technique intellectually and being able to execute it under pressure." Derek stepped forward with obvious confidence, his expensive training gear and athletic build making him look like a professional fighter compared to Margaret's grandmother-like appearance. He held the rubber training knife with casual expertise, his grip and stance demonstrating familiarity with edged weapons that came from years of serious martial arts training. "Remember, this is just quarter speed," Rivera emphasized, his tone suggesting someone ensuring that appropriate safety measures were in place for a demonstration involving a clearly outmatched participant. "Derek will present a simple thrust attack, and Mrs. Chun will attempt the basic deflection and control technique we've been covering." Margaret nodded and moved into what appeared to be a defensive position, though her stance looked uncertain and her hand positioning suggested someone trying to remember instructions rather than executing trained responses. The other students formed a wider circle to observe what everyone expected would be a clear demonstration of the skill gap that had been disrupting their training session. Derek approached with the controlled movement of an experienced martial artist, his attack presentation smooth and precise despite the reduced speed. The rubber knife moved in a perfect thrust line that should have been easy for any competent student to address with basic defensive techniques. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed by everyone present for years afterward. Margaret's response was so sudden and complete that several observers later claimed they missed the actual defensive sequence entirely in what appeared to be a single fluid motion. Derek found himself disarmed, off balance, and controlled in a position that left him completely helpless. The rubber training knife was in Margaret's hand. Derek was facing away from her with his arm secured in a control position that prevented any movement, and the entire sequence had been completed with such smooth efficiency that most students were still processing what they had just witnessed. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Derek, who moments before had been confidently demonstrating his superior skills, found himself in a position where any attempt to move resulted in increased pressure on joint structures that Margaret controlled with absolute precision. His expensive training gear and years of martial arts experience had become completely irrelevant in the face of techniques that exceeded anything he had ever encountered. Rivera stared at the demonstration with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally challenged. As an experienced instructor, he could recognize the technical sophistication of what Margaret had just executed, and he understood that the level of skill required for such precise control was far beyond anything taught in civilian martial arts programs. "Mrs. Chun," Rivera managed, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and growing respect. "That technique isn't covered in any curriculum I'm familiar with. Where exactly did you learn that particular sequence?" Margaret released Derek with gentle control, ensuring that he regained his balance without discomfort, though his face showed the particular shock that comes with discovering that fundamental assumptions about reality were incorrect. She handed him back the training knife with courtesy that suggested someone returning borrowed property rather than disarming an opponent. "I've had some previous experience with defensive techniques," Margaret replied quietly, her voice carrying the same humble tone she had maintained throughout the session, though something in her posture suggested that the careful, uncertain movements of earlier were no longer necessary. Jessica Wang, whose military police background had exposed her to various fighting systems, studied Margaret with the sharp attention of someone reassessing the situation that had taken an unexpected turn. Mrs. Chun, that control technique looked like advanced joint manipulation. What style of martial arts did you study? Margaret's response was delivered with the same modest demeanor, though observers who were paying close attention noticed that her stance had subtly shifted to something that suggested greater confidence and readiness. I learned various techniques over the years, though it's been a while since I've had occasion to practice them regularly. Derek, still processing his sudden and complete defeat, attempted to recover his dignity through analysis that would explain what had just occurred. That must have been some kind of surprise technique that works once. Real knife defense requires sustained capability under pressure, not just single moves that catch someone off guard. His words carried the defensive tone of someone whose ego had been severely damaged and who needed to minimize the significance of what had just happened. Several other students nodded in agreement, interpreting Margaret's success as a fortunate accident rather than a demonstration of genuine skill that exceeded their own capabilities. Rivera, whose instructor experience made him more capable of recognizing authentic technique, decided to test Margaret's abilities more thoroughly. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to attempt the same defense against a more committed attack? Derek can increase the speed and intensity to see if your technique works under more realistic conditions. Margaret agreed with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that her initial demonstration had been deliberately restrained, rather than representative of her full capabilities. Derek, eager to restore his reputation after the embarrassing defeat, approached the second attempt with increased aggression and speed that would challenge any civilian martial artist. The result was even more spectacular than the first demonstration. Margaret's defensive response was so fast and precise that Derek found himself not only disarmed, but taken down to the ground in a control position that left him completely helpless while Margaret maintained her standing position. The technique demonstrated levels of timing, spatial awareness, and physical coordination that exceeded anything the other students had ever witnessed. This time, the silence was accompanied by the kind of focused attention that serious martial artists give to techniques that challenge their understanding of what is possible. Rivera knelt beside Derek, who was being held in a position that controlled his entire body, through leverage applied to specific anatomical structures with surgical precision. Mrs. Chun, Rivera said quietly, this is not civilian self-defense training. What you're demonstrating requires military-level instruction. Where did you receive this training? Before Margaret could respond, Jessica Wang stepped forward with the alert posture of someone whose professional instincts had been triggered by recognition of familiar patterns. Those techniques look like advanced military combatives. The joint controls and takedown sequences are consistent with special operations training. Mrs. Chun, what branch of service were you in? Margaret helped Derek to his feet with the same gentle courtesy she had shown earlier, ensuring that he was comfortable and uninjured, despite having been completely dominated in a demonstration that had shattered his confidence. I did receive some training through military programs, though that was many years ago. Robert Castellanos, whose medical background helped him understand the anatomical precision required for Margaret's techniques, approached with the expression of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew about the situation. Mrs. Chen, the control positions you just demonstrated require detailed knowledge of joint mechanics and pressure points. That level of technical precision suggests medical or military anatomical training. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Students who had been dismissing Margaret as an elderly woman out of her element were now observing her with the respectful attention reserved for experts, whose capabilities exceeded their own. Her modest demeanor remained unchanged, but everyone present understood that they were dealing with someone whose background was far more complex than her initial appearance had suggested. Derek, attempting to process his repeated defeats while maintaining some degree of dignity, made one final attempt to minimize the significance of what had occurred. Those were grappling techniques, not knife defense, against multiple attackers. Or more realistic scenarios, that approach wouldn't be practical. His comment represented the last desperate attempt of someone whose worldview had been challenged to find explanations that would restore his sense of superiority. The other students watched this exchange with growing fascination as they began to understand that they might be witnessing something far more significant than they had initially realized. Rivera, whose instructor experience had exposed him to various military training methods, made a decision that would test Margaret's claims about her background more definitively. "Mrs. Chun, if you're willing, I'd like to set up a more comprehensive demonstration. We can simulate a more complex scenario that would test your capabilities under conditions that approximate real combat situations." Margaret nodded with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that her cover story was no longer sustainable and that the time for complete honesty was approaching. "I'm willing to participate in whatever demonstration you think would be appropriate, Instructor Rivera." The preparation for the advanced demonstration revealed Rivera's growing recognition that he was dealing with someone whose capabilities might exceed his own understanding of martial arts training. He selected his 3 most experienced students, Derek, Jessica, and Robert, to participate in a multiple attacker scenario that would challenge even professional martial artists. "This will be a controlled simulation," Rivera explained to the assembled class, his tone carrying the weight of someone whose professional curiosity had overcome his initial dismissive assessment. 3 attackers with training knives, attacking from different angles simultaneously. Mrs. Chun will attempt to neutralize all 3 threats, using whatever technique she considers appropriate. The other students formed a wider circle to observe. What everyone understood would be either a spectacular demonstration of hidden expertise or a clear revelation of Margaret's limitations when faced with realistic combat conditions. The tension in the room was palpable as serious martial artists prepared to witness a test that would definitively establish Margaret's actual capabilities. Derek, Jessica, and Robert positioned themselves at different points around Margaret, each holding rubber training knives and preparing to execute coordinated attacks that would challenge any single defender. Their combined experience represented decades of martial arts training, and their athletic capabilities were clearly superior to those of a 62-year-old woman who had appeared uncertain and awkward throughout most of the training session. Rivera provided final instructions that emphasized both safety and realism. "Attackers will execute committed attacks at 3/4 speed. Mrs. Chun, you have permission to use whatever techniques you consider necessary to neutralize the threats. Everyone understand that this is still a training exercise, and safety remains the primary concern." Margaret stood in the center of the triangle formed by her 3 opponents, her posture relaxed but alert in a way that suggested someone who had found themselves in similar situations before. The oversized sweatshirt and worn sneakers that had made her appear out of place throughout the session now seemed less relevant as observers focused on subtle indicators of readiness and capability that had been present but unnoticed earlier. The attack began with Derek moving forward in a committed thrust while Jessica approached from the side with an overhead strike and Robert closed from behind with a horizontal slash. The coordination required serious skill and represented the kind of multiple threat scenario that challenged professional combatives instructors. What happened next would be analyzed frame by frame by everyone present and would fundamentally change how they understood the relationship between appearance and capability. Margaret's response was a masterpiece of combat efficiency that compressed multiple defensive techniques into a single flowing sequence that appeared almost choreographed in its precision. In approximately 7 seconds, all 3 attackers found themselves disarmed and controlled in positions that left them completely helpless while Margaret remained standing in the center of their formation. Derek, who had initiated the attack with confident aggression, discovered that his knife had been taken from him before his thrust reached its intended target, and he was now being held in an arm control that prevented any movement while causing no injury. Jessica, whose overhead attack should have provided an insurmountable challenge to anyone defending against multiple opponents, found herself face down on the training mat with her knife in Margaret's possession and her mobility completely controlled through leverage applied to anatomical structures she hadn't known could be manipulated so precisely. Robert, approaching from what should have been a blind spot, had been intercepted with techniques that suggested Margaret maintained complete awareness of her surroundings throughout the engagement. His knife was now in Margaret's control, along with the other two weapons, and he was held in a standing position that immobilized him through pressure applied to specific nerve clusters that created compliance without causing damage. The silence that followed was the profound quiet that occurs when a group of people realizes that they have just witnessed something that challenges their fundamental understanding of reality. Margaret held 3 training knives while controlling 3 experienced martial artists in positions that demonstrated technical sophistication far beyond anything taught in civilian programs. Rivera approached the demonstration area with the careful movements of someone whose professional expertise had just been exceeded in ways that required complete reassessment of the situation. "Mrs. Chen, would you please release the controls so we can process what just occurred?" Margaret released all 3 students with the same gentle precision she had shown earlier, ensuring that they regained their balance and mobility without discomfort despite having been completely dominated. In a demonstration that had lasted only seconds, she placed the 3 training knives on the nearby equipment table with the casual efficiency of someone returning borrowed tools. Jessica Wang, whose military police background provided context for understanding advanced combat techniques, was the first to articulate what everyone was beginning to realize. "Mrs. Chen, those techniques are not civilian martial arts. What you just demonstrated requires specialized military training at the highest levels. Who trained you?" Margaret's response carried the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to maintain pretenses about her background or capabilities. "I received my initial training through specialized military programs, though my techniques were refined through years of practical application in various operational environments." Derek, still processing his 3rd consecutive defeat and the complete destruction of his assumptions about martial arts hierarchy, managed to ask the question that everyone was thinking. "Mrs. Chen, if you have this level of training, why did you act like a beginner throughout the entire class?" Margaret's answer revealed the complexity of her situation and the reasons for her careful deception throughout the training session. "I came here to observe current civilian training methods and to assess the quality of instruction being provided to students who might face real-world violence. My initial approach was designed to blend in with genuine beginners rather than to showcase capabilities that might interfere with the learning environment." Rivera, whose instructor experience was helping him process the implications of what he had just witnessed, asked the question that would reveal the true significance of Margaret's presence at his academy. "Mrs. Chen, are you evaluating our program for some kind of official purpose? Are you here in a professional capacity?" Margaret's response would transform the entire dynamic of the training session and reveal why she had chosen to endure humiliation rather than demonstrate her true capabilities from the beginning. "Instructor Rivera, I'm here because 3 women who trained at this academy were attacked 6 weeks ago, and their defensive techniques failed completely. 2 of them are still in the hospital, and 1 will never fully recover from her injuries." The statement hit the room like a physical blow as everyone present realized that Margaret's evaluation of their training wasn't academic curiosity, but investigation of methods that had failed when students' lives depended on their effectiveness. The techniques they had been practicing, the instruction they had been receiving, and the confidence they had been developing were all being assessed by someone whose expertise came from situations where failure meant death, the attacker's in. That assault used coordinated techniques similar to what we just practiced. Margaret continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that training inadequacies had real consequences. The victims had trained here for over a year, but their defensive responses were ineffective against opponents who understood how to counter the techniques they had been taught. Rivera's face showed the expression of an instructor confronting the possibility that his teaching methods were insufficient for real-world applications. "Mrs. Chen, are you suggesting that our training program is inadequate?" Margaret's response was delivered with the directness of someone whose professional assessment had revealed serious deficiencies that needed to be addressed immediately. "Instructor Rivera, your techniques are based on traditional martial arts that assume single attackers using predictable patterns. Real violence involves multiple opponents who coordinate their attacks and counter expected defensive responses. Your students are learning to defend against training scenarios that don't reflect actual threats." The implications of Margaret's assessment were staggering for everyone present. They had been training with confidence in techniques that were apparently inadequate for the threats they might actually face. Their instructor, whose credentials and experience they had trusted, was being evaluated by someone whose expertise revealed fundamental flaws in their preparation. Jessica Wang, whose military background gave her context for understanding the difference between training and operational reality, asked the question that would reveal the extent of Margaret's qualifications to make such assessments. "Mrs. Chen, what operational background gives you the authority to evaluate combat training programs?" Margaret's answer would reveal why her initial appearance as a confused elderly woman had been so convincing, and why her assessment of their training carried the weight of ultimate authority. "I spent 23 years in military special operations, with the last 8 years developing hand-to-hand combat training for personnel deployed in high-threat environments. After retirement, I've consulted on civilian training programs to assess their effectiveness for real-world applications." The room fell into stunned silence as students processed the revelation that they had been dismissing and humiliating someone whose expertise in combat training exceeded that of anyone they had ever encountered. Margaret's modest appearance, her careful questions, and her apparent struggles with basic techniques had all been elements of a professional assessment that was now revealing serious inadequacies in their preparation. Rivera, whose reputation and career were built on his ability to teach effective martial arts, found himself confronting the possibility that his entire instructional approach was fundamentally flawed. "Mrs. Chen, if our training is inadequate, what would you recommend to improve our students' defensive capabilities?" Margaret's response revealed the depth of the problems she had identified and the extensive changes that would be required to address them effectively. "Instructor Rivera, effective knife defense requires complete restructuring of your training methodology. Current techniques assume compliant opponents and predictable attack patterns. Real threats involve multiple attackers who coordinate their movements and adapt to defensive responses." The demonstration that followed would reveal why traditional martial arts training often failed when applied to actual violence and would showcase defensive techniques that addressed real-world scenarios rather than training exercises. Margaret asked for volunteers to participate in simulations that would reveal the difference between classroom learning and operational effectiveness. Derek, despite his repeated defeats, stepped forward with the determination of someone whose competitive nature demanded that he understand exactly how his training had been insufficient. "Mrs. Chen, I'd like to understand where my technique failed and how real defensive methods would differ from what we've been practicing." Margaret's instructional approach revealed teaching methods that differed dramatically from traditional martial arts pedagogy. Instead of focusing on specific techniques, she emphasized principles that could be adapted to various situations. Instead of assuming single attackers, she trained responses to coordinated threats. Instead of expecting compliance, she prepared students for opponents who would counter their defensive attempts. Derek, your defensive technique failed because it assumed that disarming one attacker would neutralize the threat. Margaret explained as she positioned additional students to simulate realistic attack scenarios. In real situations, removing one weapon means nothing if other attackers continue their assault. Effective defense requires controlling multiple threats simultaneously while maintaining mobility and situational awareness. The training session that followed was unlike anything the students had ever experienced. Margaret's instruction revealed defensive concepts that addressed the realities of violence rather than the assumptions of traditional training. Students learned to recognize the difference between techniques that worked in controlled environments and methods that remained effective when facing determined opponents who fought back. Jessica Wang, whose military background helped her appreciate the sophistication of Margaret's instruction, asked questions that revealed how incomplete her previous training had been. Mrs. Chun, the joint control techniques you're demonstrating require precision that seems impossible to achieve under stress. How do you maintain that level of accuracy during actual combat? Margaret's answer revealed why her techniques had been so effective during the earlier demonstrations and why traditional training often failed under real conditions. Jessica, accuracy comes from understanding anatomical principles rather than memorizing specific techniques. When you understand how joints function and where pressure points create compliance, you can adapt your responses to whatever situation develops. The afternoon training session revealed the extent to which Margaret's expertise exceeded not only that of the students, but also that of Rivera himself. Her knowledge of combat applications, her understanding of threat dynamics, and her ability to teach effective defensive responses came from experience that traditional martial arts instructors simply didn't possess. As the session continued, students began to understand why their previous training had given them false confidence in their defensive capabilities. The techniques they had mastered in controlled environments became ineffective when opponents used realistic tactics. The scenarios they had practiced didn't prepare them for the chaos and unpredictability of actual violence. Rivera, whose professional integrity required acknowledging the superiority of Margaret's methods, despite the blow to his ego, made a decision that would benefit all his students. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to serve as a consulting instructor for our program? Your expertise could help us develop training that actually prepares students for real-world threats. Margaret's agreement to redesign the Academy's curriculum would transform not only the specific program, but would influence civilian martial arts training throughout the region as other instructors learned about methods that addressed actual violence rather than training assumptions. The changes she implemented went far beyond technique, modification to address the psychological and tactical realities that traditional training ignored. Students learned to function under stress, to maintain awareness of multiple threats, and to adapt their responses when initial techniques were countered by intelligent opponents. 6 months later, the Academy's reputation had been transformed from a traditional martial arts school to a center for reality-based defensive training that attracted students from law enforcement, military, and civilian backgrounds who wanted preparation for actual threats rather than training exercises. The 3 women whose assault had prompted Margaret's investigation were among the first to benefit from the revised curriculum. Their recovery included learning defensive techniques that would have prevented their injuries and would protect them from future attacks. The systematic changes that resulted from Margaret's evaluation had transformed potential victims into capable defenders. Margaret's final assessment of the program revealed why her initial deception had been necessary to obtain accurate information about training quality and student preparation. When instructors know they're being evaluated, they modify their behavior to create favorable impressions. When students know they're being tested, they attempt to exceed their normal performance levels. Only by observing genuine training sessions could I assess actual program effectiveness. The broader implications of Margaret's work extended beyond the single academy to influence civilian defensive training throughout the martial arts community. Her methods demonstrated that effective self-defense required abandoning traditional approaches in favor of training that addressed real violence rather than stylized combat scenarios. The story of the elderly woman who was humiliated in knife fighting class before demonstrating expertise that exceeded everyone present became legendary within martial arts circles, serving as a reminder that expertise takes many forms and that appearances often conceal capabilities that exceed the observer's ability to recognize. Margaret returned to her quiet retirement, carrying the satisfaction of knowing that her work had prevented future tragedies by replacing ineffective training with methods that would protect students when their lives depended on their defensive skills. The bakery she operated served her neighborhood with the same humble efficiency she had brought to her evaluation of combat training, though regular customers sometimes noticed that their elderly baker moved with unusual grace and maintained awareness of her surroundings that seemed beyond what her peaceful occupation would require. The Academy's transformation became a model for reality-based defensive training that attracted attention from professional organizations and military training commands interested in improving civilian preparation for actual threats. Margaret's methods were studied, adapted, and implemented throughout training programs that recognized the difference between traditional martial arts and practical defensive skills. Years later, when new students asked about the origins of the Koshwe Academy's unique approach to defensive training, instructors would tell them about the elderly woman, whose assessment had revealed the inadequacies of traditional methods and whose expertise had transformed their understanding of what effective self-defense training required. The lessons learned extended beyond specific techniques to encompass broader principles about the nature of expertise and the danger of making assumptions based on appearance. The martial arts community had learned that real capability often hides behind modest presentations, and that true masters are often those who appear least impressive to casual observation. Margaret Chun's legacy continued to influence defensive training long after her formal consultation ended, reminding instructors and students that effective martial arts must be grounded in reality rather than tradition, and that the ultimate test of any technique is not how it performs in training, but whether it protects lives when violence erupts without warning or compromise. The investigation that had brought Margaret to the Academy ran deeper than a simple evaluation of training methods. 3 weeks after her dramatic demonstration, she sat in the sterile conference room of Metro General Hospital, reviewing medical files that painted a disturbing picture of systematic violence, targeting women who had received defensive training from various martial arts schools throughout the city. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the trauma surgeon who had treated the 3 assault victims, spread the photographs and medical reports across the polished table with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen too much violence to be shocked by its documentation. The injuries sustained by all 3 victims show identical patterns, Dr. Mitchell explained, her voice carrying the clinical detachment that medical professionals develop when dealing with traumatic cases. Specific nerve strikes to disable defensive responses, joint manipulation to prevent escape attempts, and tissue damage that suggests the attackers possessed advanced knowledge of human anatomy and pain compliance techniques. Margaret studied the medical documentation with the focused attention of someone whose expertise allowed her to read the story of violence written in clinical terminology. The attack patterns revealed coordination and technique that exceeded the capabilities of common criminals operating opportunistically. These were planned assaults executed by individuals who understood how to counter the defensive training that their victims had received. Dr. Mitchell, these injury patterns suggest that the attackers knew exactly what defensive responses to expect from their victims, Margaret observed, her finger tracing the documented evidence of systematic brutality. The nerve strikes were placed to neutralize specific techniques taught in civilian self-defense programs. The joint attacks targeted areas that would prevent the escape methods these women had been taught to rely upon. The implications were chilling for anyone who understood the tactical sophistication required for such precise violence. The attackers hadn't simply overpowered their victims through superior strength or numbers. They had systematically neutralized defensive techniques through counters that suggested intimate familiarity with civilian martial arts training methods. Detective Maria Santos, who had been investigating the assault cases without significant progress, joined the meeting with files that revealed the broader scope of the problem. Her investigation had identified 17 similar attacks over the past 8 months, all targeting women who had received defensive training from academies throughout the metropolitan area. The pattern suggested predators who were specifically selecting victims based on their martial arts background rather than avoiding trained individuals as most criminals would. The attack locations show careful planning and surveillance, Detective Santos explained as she displayed crime scene photographs and victimology analysis. All 3 locations provided the attackers with multiple escape routes and minimal chance of witness observation. The timing suggests that the perpetrators had detailed knowledge of their victims' schedules and movement patterns. Margaret's review of the investigative files revealed tactical elements that concerned her more than the clinical evidence of violence. The criminals weren't simply targeting trained women, they were hunting them with methods that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds that had been corrupted for predatory purposes. Detective Santos, have you identified any connections between the various martial arts academies where these victims received their training? Margaret asked, her investigative instincts focusing on patterns that might reveal the source of the tactical intelligence being used against the victims. The detective's response revealed the complexity of the criminal network they were confronting. We've identified at least 12 different schools and training facilities attended by the victims over the past 2 years. The academies range from traditional martial arts to modern self-defense programs, with no apparent common instructors or training methodologies. Margaret's analysis of the training diversity suggested that the attackers possessed broad knowledge of various defensive systems rather than specific familiarity with individual programs. This level of tactical awareness indicated professional training that had been perverted for criminal purposes, possibly by individuals with military or law enforcement backgrounds who had access to multiple training curricula. The breakthrough in understanding came when Margaret requested access to surveillance footage from the areas surrounding the attack locations. Her review of the security camera data revealed something that the police investigation had missed: individuals conducting surveillance of the victims for extended periods before the attacks occurred. Dr. Mitchell, Detective Santos, look at these surveillance patterns, Margaret said as she displayed enhanced footage on her laptop screen. These aren't random attacks by opportunistic criminals. We're looking at professional surveillance followed by precisely planned assaults using techniques specifically designed to counter the victim's defensive training. The surveillance footage showed men in unremarkable clothing maintaining observation of the victims from multiple positions over periods of days or weeks before the attacks. Their movement patterns, positioning choices, and surveillance techniques demonstrated training that exceeded the capabilities of common criminals operating without professional instruction. Detective Santos studied the enhanced footage with growing alarm as she recognized the implications of what Margaret had discovered. These surveillance techniques are consistent with methods used by professional intelligence operatives or military reconnaissance personnel. The individuals conducting this surveillance have received advanced training in covert observation and target assessment. Margaret's concern extended beyond the immediate criminal activity to the broader implications of what appeared to be systematic hunting of women who had sought defensive training to protect themselves. The attacks weren't random violence but calculated predation that specifically targeted individuals who had attempted to develop protective capabilities. The investigation expanded when Margaret's contacts within military and law enforcement communities provided information about similar attack patterns occurring in other metropolitan areas throughout the region. The tactical sophistication and victim selection criteria suggested an organized network rather than isolated criminal activity in a single location. Colonel James Harrison, Margaret's former commanding officer who now worked with federal law enforcement agencies investigating organized crime, provided classified briefings that revealed the national scope of what they were confronting. Margaret, we're tracking similar attack patterns in 7 major cities across 3 states. The techniques being used suggest coordination at a level that exceeds typical criminal organization capabilities. The federal investigation revealed connections between the local attacks and broader criminal networks that were exploiting vulnerabilities in civilian defensive training to identify and target victims who believed they had developed protective capabilities. The systematic nature of the attack suggested that someone was teaching predators how to counter civilian martial arts training for criminal purposes. Margaret's analysis of the federal data revealed patterns that connected the local attacks to a much larger criminal enterprise. Colonel Harrison, these aren't isolated attacks by local predators. We're looking at a systematic operation that identifies women receiving defensive training, analyzes their specific techniques, then deploys attackers who know exactly how to counter their defensive responses. The scope of the criminal network became clear as federal investigators shared intelligence about training camps where individuals with military or law enforcement backgrounds were teaching criminal techniques to predators who specifically targeted women who had received martial arts instruction. The camps provided tactical training that turned civilian defensive capabilities into vulnerabilities that could be exploited by knowledgeable attackers. Detective Santos coordinated with federal agencies to develop strategies for identifying and apprehending the individuals responsible for the local attacks, while Margaret focused on analyzing the tactical methods being used to ensure that future victims could be better prepared to defend themselves against such sophisticated threats. The investigative breakthrough came when surveillance footage from multiple attack locations revealed the same individuals conducting reconnaissance operations before different assaults. The facial recognition analysis confirmed that a coordinated team was responsible for the attacks throughout the metropolitan area, using systematic surveillance and coordinated assault techniques that indicated professional criminal organization. Margaret's expertise in special operations tactics allowed her to identify specific surveillance and assault patterns that revealed how the criminal team operated. Detective Santos, these attackers are using modified military reconnaissance techniques to identify potential victims and assess their defensive capabilities before planning specific assault methods designed to counter their training. The tactical analysis revealed that the criminal team consisted of at least 6 individuals with specialized roles that included surveillance specialists, tactical coordinators, and assault personnel who possessed advanced knowledge of various martial arts and defensive training systems. Their operation demonstrated planning and coordination that exceeded the capabilities of typical criminal organizations. Federal agents working with local law enforcement developed an operation to identify and apprehend the criminal network using surveillance techniques that would allow them to observe the predators' reconnaissance activities without alerting them to the investigation. Margaret's tactical expertise was crucial in designing surveillance methods that could observe professional operators without being detected. The federal operation revealed connections between the local criminal network and organized crime families that were diversifying into human trafficking and exploitation activities that specifically targeted women who believed they had developed defensive capabilities. The systematic hunting of trained women represented a new category of predatory crime that exploited the false confidence created by inadequate defensive training. Margaret's role in the federal investigation extended beyond tactical analysis. to training law enforcement personnel in the advanced combat techniques that would be necessary to apprehend individuals who possessed military-level capabilities. The criminals they were pursuing would not be intimidated by conventional law enforcement tactics and would require specialized apprehension techniques. The complexity of the criminal network became apparent when federal investigators discovered that the predators were receiving intelligence about their potential victims from sources within the martial arts community itself. Instructors at various academies were providing information about female students who had completed defensive training programs, essentially creating victim lists for criminal organizations. Margaret, we've identified at least 4 martial arts instructors who have been providing student information to criminal contacts. Colonel Harrison reported during a classified briefing that revealed the scope of corruption within the civilian training community. These instructors are essentially selling their students to predators who know exactly how to counter their defensive techniques. The revelation that martial arts instructors were betraying their students for profit added a layer of corruption to the investigation that made Margaret's undercover evaluation of the Urban Defense Academy even more significant. Her assessment of training quality was complicated by the need to identify potential sources of intelligence that could be reaching criminal networks. Detective Santos coordinated with federal agents to develop strategies for identifying corrupted instructors while protecting the investigation from compromise by individuals who might be providing information to criminal organizations. The operation required careful coordination to avoid alerting either the criminal network or potentially compromised martial arts instructors about the scope of the federal investigation. Margaret's analysis of the Urban Defense Academy's operations focused not only on training effectiveness, but also on identifying potential security vulnerabilities that could be exploited by criminal networks seeking information about female students. Her undercover evaluation revealed administrative practices that could provide access to student information by individuals with criminal intent. The investigation expanded when federal surveillance of the criminal network revealed plans for attacks in additional cities throughout the region. The systematic expansion of predatory operations targeting trained women indicated that the criminal organization was achieving sufficient success to justify scaling their activities to additional metropolitan areas. Colonel Harrison briefed Margaret on intelligence indicating that the criminal network was recruiting additional personnel with military or law enforcement backgrounds who had been discharged under adverse circumstances and were seeking income sources that utilized their tactical training for illegal purposes. The recruitment of professional operators significantly increased the threat level facing potential victims throughout the region. Federal agents working undercover within the criminal recruitment process provided intelligence about training methods being used to prepare attackers for specific types of victims. The criminals were receiving instruction not only in various martial arts techniques but also in psychological manipulation methods designed to identify and exploit the mental vulnerabilities that often accompanied inadequate defensive training. Margaret's expertise in psychological operations allowed her to analyze the criminal training methods and develop countermeasures that could be implemented through reformed defensive training programs. Her recommendations addressed not only physical techniques but also mental preparation that would help potential victims maintain effectiveness under the psychological pressure that sophisticated attackers would apply. The federal operation to apprehend the criminal network required coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions, with Margaret serving as tactical advisor for the law enforcement teams that would confront individuals with advanced military training. The complexity of the operation reflected the professional capabilities of the criminals they were pursuing. Detective Santos received authorization to coordinate local law enforcement participation in the federal operation while maintaining the security necessary to prevent compromise of the investigation by potentially corrupted individuals within the martial arts community. The operation required careful screening of all personnel to ensure that information didn't reach criminal contacts. The tactical planning for apprehending the criminal network revealed the extent to which professional military training had been corrupted for predatory purposes. Margaret's analysis of the criminals' capabilities indicated that conventional law enforcement tactics would be insufficient for safely apprehending individuals who possessed advanced combat training and would not hesitate to use lethal force against officers. Federal tactical teams received specialized training from Margaret in techniques designed to neutralize individuals with military backgrounds who might attempt to use their combat training against law enforcement personnel. The preparation reflected the serious threat posed by criminals who possessed professional tactical capabilities. The breakthrough that would lead to dismantling the criminal network came when federal surveillance identified the location where attackers were receiving advanced tactical training designed to counter civilian defensive techniques. The training facility was operated by discharged military personnel who were teaching criminal applications of special operations techniques. Margaret's reconnaissance of the criminal training facility revealed methods being used to prepare attackers for specific categories of victims based on their martial arts backgrounds. The systematic approach to criminal training indicated that the predatory network was operating with military-level organization and tactical sophistication. Colonel Harrison, this criminal training facility is using modified special operations training methods to prepare attackers for civilian targets, Margaret reported after completing her covert assessment of the facility. They're teaching systematic exploitation of vulnerabilities in civilian defensive training, essentially turning martial arts students into preferred targets for predatory attacks. The intelligence gathered about the criminal training facility provided federal agencies with the evidence necessary to obtain warrants for apprehending the entire network while simultaneously protecting potential victims by shutting down the source of tactical intelligence being used against them. Federal coordination of the apprehension operation required careful timing to ensure that all members of the criminal network could be arrested simultaneously without alerting others to the investigation. Margaret's tactical expertise was crucial in planning the coordination necessary to apprehend professional operators who would attempt to escape or resist arrest using advanced combat techniques. Detective Santos coordinated local law enforcement support for the federal operation while maintaining security protocols that would prevent compromise of the investigation during the critical phases of suspect apprehension. The complexity of coordinating multiple arrest teams reflected the scope of the criminal network and the geographic distribution of their operations. The simultaneous arrests of criminal network members throughout multiple jurisdictions resulted in the apprehension of 43 individuals involved in various aspects of the predatory operations targeting trained women. The scope of the network exceeded initial estimates and revealed the extent to which organized crime had infiltrated the martial arts community. Margaret's analysis of evidence seized during the arrests revealed detailed files on hundreds of potential victims throughout the region, including photographs, personal information, and assessments of their defensive training that had been compiled through surveillance and intelligence provided by corrupted instructors. The systematic documentation of potential victims demonstrated the industrial scale of the predatory operations. The federal investigation revealed that the criminal network had been generating substantial profits through various exploitation activities that specifically targeted women who believed they had developed defensive capabilities through martial arts training. The financial success of the operations explained the sophisticated organization and professional capabilities that had been devoted to the criminal activities. Colonel Harrison briefed Margaret on the broader implications of the investigation, which had revealed similar criminal networks operating in multiple regions throughout the country. Margaret, this appears to be a systematic exploitation of vulnerabilities in civilian defensive training that extends far beyond our initial local investigation. We're dealing with organized criminal enterprises that are specifically targeting the martial arts community. The national scope of the problem indicated that Margaret's work at the Urban Defense Academy was part of a much larger effort to reform civilian defensive training to address vulnerabilities that were being systematically exploited by sophisticated criminal organizations. Her assessment methods and training reforms would need to be implemented broadly to protect potential victims throughout the martial arts community. Detective Santos coordinated with federal agencies to ensure that the investigation continued to identify additional criminal network members while implementing protection measures for potential victims whose information had been compromised. During the intelligence gathering phase of the predatory operations, the trial proceedings that followed the arrests revealed the full scope of the criminal operations and the systematic exploitation of civilian defensive training vulnerabilities. Testimony from arrested network members provided detailed information about methods used to identify, assess, and attack women who had received martial arts instruction. Margaret testified as an expert witness about the tactical sophistication of the criminal methods and the reforms necessary to address the vulnerabilities that had been exploited. Her testimony provided the court with technical analysis that established the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise and the professional capabilities of the individuals involved. The convictions that resulted from the federal investigation sent 43 individuals to federal prison for terms ranging from 15 to 35 years, effectively dismantling the criminal network while sending a clear message that exploitation of martial arts students would be prosecuted with the full resources of federal law enforcement. Dr. Mitchell provided testimony about the medical evidence that demonstrated the systematic nature of the attacks and the advanced anatomical knowledge possessed by the attackers. Her testimony established the professional training that had been required to inflict the specific injury patterns found in all the assault victims. The broader implications of the federal investigation led to reforms in how martial arts academies maintained student information and communicated with law enforcement about potential threats. Margaret's recommendations for improved security protocols were implemented throughout the martial arts community to prevent future exploitation of student information by criminal organizations. Federal agencies established ongoing monitoring programs to identify potential reformation of similar criminal networks while providing resources for civilian defensive training programs to implement improved techniques that would be more effective against sophisticated attackers with professional tactical training. Margaret's work extended beyond the immediate investigation to developing comprehensive training reforms that addressed the systematic vulnerabilities that had been exploited by the criminal network. Her expertise in both special operations and civilian training allowed her to bridge the gap between military-level defensive techniques and civilian applications. The 3 women whose assault had initiated Margaret's investigation received advanced defensive training based on the reforms that resulted from the federal operation. Their recovery included not only physical healing, but also development of genuine defensive capabilities that would protect them from future attacks by sophisticated predators. The lasting impact of Margaret's investigation extended throughout the martial arts community as academies implemented reformed training methods that addressed real-world threats rather than traditional martial arts assumptions. The systematic changes represented a fundamental shift in how civilian defensive training was approached and evaluated. Federal law enforcement agencies incorporated Margaret's tactical analysis methods into ongoing investigations of organized crime activities that targeted specific communities or training populations. Her expertise in recognizing systematic criminal exploitation became a resource for protecting vulnerable populations from predatory organizations. The criminal network's systematic exploitation of martial arts students had been stopped, but the investigation revealed the extent to which organized crime was adapting to exploit new categories of victims through sophisticated tactical methods that required equally sophisticated law enforcement responses. Margaret's role in exposing and dismantling the criminal network demonstrated that effective law enforcement against organized crime required expertise that matched or exceeded the professional capabilities of the criminals being pursued. Her military background had been essential in recognizing and countering the tactical sophistication of the predatory operations. The reforms implemented throughout the martial arts community as a result of Margaret's investigation created lasting improvements in how civilian defensive training addressed real-world threats. The systematic changes protected not only current students, but future generations of individuals seeking to develop genuine defensive capabilities. The federal investigation had revealed that criminals with professional training were systematically exploiting vulnerabilities in civilian preparation. But Margaret's work had also demonstrated that proper expertise could identify and counter such exploitation, while implementing effective protective measures for potential victims. The transformation of civilian defensive training that followed Margaret's investigation extended far beyond individual academies to influence how law enforcement, military, and educational institutions approached personal protection instruction for vulnerable populations. Her comprehensive analysis of systematic criminal exploitation had revealed fundamental flaws in traditional training approaches that required complete restructuring of how defensive capabilities were developed and assessed. 6 months after the federal arrests, Margaret found herself testifying before a Senate subcommittee investigating the exploitation of civilian training programs by organized criminal enterprises. The hearing room was packed with representatives from law enforcement agencies, military training commands, and civilian martial arts organizations who had come to understand that the problems Margaret had uncovered represented a national security issue requiring coordinated response. Senator Patricia Williams, who chaired the subcommittee on organized crime and public safety, opened the hearings with statistics that demonstrated the scope of predatory operations targeting trained civilians throughout the country. Ms. Chun, your investigation revealed that organized criminal networks were systematically exploiting vulnerabilities in civilian defensive training. Can you explain to this committee how widespread this exploitation has become? Margaret's testimony drew on intelligence gathered from federal investigations in 12 states that had identified similar criminal operations targeting martial arts students, self-defense class participants, and individuals who had received personal protection training through various civilian programs. The systematic nature of the exploitation had revealed vulnerabilities that extended throughout the entire civilian training infrastructure. Senator Williams, our investigation identified criminal networks operating in 43 metropolitan areas across 12 states, with documented attacks on over 300 individuals who had received civilian defensive training, Margaret explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose expertise had been validated through successful federal operations. These networks were generating annual revenues exceeding $50 million through various exploitation activities that specifically targeted individuals who believed they had developed protective capabilities. The financial scope of the criminal operations stunned committee members, who had initially viewed the issue as isolated local crime rather than organized exploitation operating at industrial scale. The systematic nature of the predatory activities had created a shadow economy that profited from the false confidence generated by inadequate defensive training. General Patricia Hayes, who had been invited to provide military perspective on the training vulnerabilities that had been exploited, testified about similar patterns affecting military family members who had received civilian defensive instruction. Senator Williams, we've documented cases where military dependents who received civilian self-defense training were specifically targeted by criminal organizations that understood how to counter their defensive techniques. The military implications added a national security dimension to the hearings as committee members understood that criminal organizations were systematically exploiting training, deficiencies that affected not only civilian populations, but also military families and law enforcement personnel who had supplemented their professional training with civilian programs. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a forensic psychologist who had analyzed the psychological methods used by the criminal networks, provided testimony about the systematic, psychological manipulation that accompanied the physical exploitation of training vulnerabilities. The criminal organizations weren't simply overpowering their victims through superior force. They were using sophisticated psychological techniques to exploit the false confidence created by inadequate training. Margaret's analysis of the psychological exploitation revealed that criminals had developed systematic methods for identifying individuals whose training had created overconfidence in their defensive capabilities without providing genuine protective skills. The predators understood how to recognize and exploit the specific mental vulnerabilities that accompanied inadequate preparation. The criminal training facilities we identified were teaching systematic psychological manipulation techniques, alongside physical methods for countering civilian defensive training. Margaret explained during detailed questioning about the sophistication of the predatory operations. These weren't common criminals using crude tactics. We were dealing with professional operators who understood both the physical and psychological vulnerabilities created by traditional martial arts training. FBI Director Sarah Thompson provided classified testimony about the intelligence resources that criminal organizations had devoted to analyzing civilian training programs and identifying systematic vulnerabilities that could be exploited for profit. The level of professional analysis applied by the criminal networks had exceeded the assessment capabilities of many legitimate training organizations. The hearings revealed that criminal organizations had infiltrated martial arts tournaments, self-defense seminars, and training conferences to gather intelligence about civilian defensive techniques and identify potential victims who possessed the specific combination of false confidence and genuine vulnerability that made them preferred targets for exploitation. Margaret's recommendations for addressing the systematic vulnerabilities required comprehensive reform of how civilian defensive training was regulated, assessed, and implemented. Senator Williams, effective reform requires federal standards for civilian defensive training that ensure programs actually develop protective capabilities rather than creating false confidence that increases vulnerability to sophisticated predators. The federal standards that Margaret proposed would require civilian training programs to demonstrate effectiveness against realistic threats rather than traditional martial arts scenarios that bore little resemblance to actual violence. The assessment methods would need to address both physical capabilities and psychological preparation necessary for functioning effectively under genuine threat conditions. Senator Robert Chen, whose district included several of the metropolitan areas where criminal exploitation had been identified, questioned Margaret about the timeline necessary for implementing comprehensive reforms that would protect civilian populations while the training infrastructure adapted to more effective methods. Ms. Chen, how quickly can civilian training programs implement the reforms necessary to address these vulnerabilities without leaving current students unprotected during the transition period? Senator Chen asked, his concern reflecting the need to balance immediate protection with long-term systematic improvement. Margaret's response outlined a phased implementation strategy that would provide immediate protection measures while civilian training programs develop the expertise necessary for more comprehensive reforms. Senator Chen, we recommend immediate implementation of awareness programs that help individuals understand the limitations of their current training while developing transitional protective measures that can be implemented quickly. The transitional measures included psychological preparation that would help trained individuals recognize and respond appropriately to sophisticated threats without relying exclusively on physical techniques that might be ineffective against professional predators. The mental preparation was often more important than specific physical skills for surviving encounters with organized criminal operations. Colonel Harrison provided testimony about military resources that could be made available to support civilian training reform while maintaining operational security around classified techniques that would not be appropriate for civilian instruction. The military support would focus on training principles and assessment methods rather than specific tactical applications. The committee's final recommendations included federal funding for comprehensive reform of civilian defensive training, standards, establishment of assessment criteria that evaluated effectiveness against realistic threats, and creation of oversight mechanisms that would prevent future exploitation of training vulnerabilities by criminal organizations. Margaret's role in implementing the federal reforms extended beyond testimony to direct involvement in developing the new training standards and assessment methods that would protect civilian populations from systematic criminal exploitation. Her expertise in both special operations and civilian training made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between military-level effectiveness and civilian applications. The Urban Defense Academy became a pilot program for implementing the new federal standards, with Rivera serving as lead instructor for training methods that addressed realistic threats, rather than traditional martial arts assumptions. The transformation of his program demonstrated how existing academies could adapt their instruction to provide genuine protective capabilities. The 3 women whose assault had initiated Margaret's investigation became instructors in the reform training programs, their experience as survivors providing valuable perspective on the psychological and physical realities of facing sophisticated attackers. Their involvement ensured that the new training methods addressed the actual needs of potential victims rather than theoretical scenarios. Federal law enforcement agencies established permanent task forces to monitor potential reformation of criminal networks while providing ongoing support for civilian training programs implementing new standards. The task forces included Margaret's assessment methods as standard procedures for identifying systematic criminal exploitation of training vulnerabilities. The broader implications of Margaret's work influenced international cooperation between law enforcement agencies that were confronting similar criminal exploitation of civilian training programs in other countries. Her methods for identifying and countering systematic predatory operations became part of international law enforcement training curricula. Detective Santos, who had coordinated the local aspects of the federal investigation, was promoted to head a new state task force focused on protecting civilian training populations from organized criminal exploitation. Her experience working with Margaret provided the law enforcement perspective necessary for implementing effective protective measures. Dr. Mitchell established a medical research program that studied the long-term physical and psychological recovery patterns of victims who had been systematically exploited through their defensive training. Her research provided evidence-based approaches for helping survivors overcome the trauma of having their protective efforts turned against them by sophisticated predators. The medical research revealed that victims of systematic exploitation required specialized treatment approaches that addressed both the physical trauma and the psychological damage caused by the betrayal of their training. Traditional victim support services were inadequate for addressing the complex trauma experienced by individuals whose protective efforts had been systematically defeated. Margaret's consultation work expanded to include military family support programs, law enforcement dependent protection initiatives, and educational institution safety programs that needed to address the specific vulnerabilities of populations that might be targeted by criminal organizations seeking to exploit their defensive training. The financial investigations that accompanied the federal prosecutions revealed the extent to which criminal organizations had been investing in sophisticated Intelligence operations designed to identify and exploit systematic vulnerabilities in civilian preparation. The professional resources devoted to predatory operations had exceeded the assessment capabilities of most legitimate training organizations. Federal sentencing guidelines were revised to reflect the systematic nature of organized exploitation of civilian training programs, with enhanced penalties for criminal enterprises that targeted individuals based on their protective training backgrounds. The legal reforms recognized that such predatory operations represented a distinct category of organized crime requiring specialized prosecution approaches. The psychological research conducted on the criminal network members revealed recruitment and training patterns that specifically targeted individuals with professional tactical backgrounds who had become disaffected with legitimate applications of their skills. The criminal organizations had systematically corrupted professional capabilities for predatory purposes. Margaret's analysis of the criminal recruitment methods led to improved screening procedures for military and law enforcement personnel, leaving professional service with enhanced support programs designed to prevent the corruption of professional tactical training for criminal applications. The prevention programs addressed both individual and systematic factors that had contributed to the recruitment of professional operators for predatory activities. The international implications of Margaret's investigation led to cooperation. Agreements between federal agencies and foreign law enforcement organizations that were confronting similar systematic exploitation of civilian training populations. Her methods for identifying and countering organized predatory operations became part of international law enforcement collaboration frameworks. The victim support programs that resulted from the federal investigation included specialized services for individuals whose protective training had been systematically exploited, with treatment approaches that addressed the complex trauma of having preparation intended for protection turned into vulnerability by sophisticated predators. Margaret's ongoing work with victim recovery programs revealed long-term patterns of healing and empowerment that resulted from providing genuine protective capabilities to individuals whose previous training had been systematically exploited. The transformation from victimization to empowerment required both physical skill development and psychological recovery from the betrayal of their protective efforts. The educational institutions that implemented Margaret's assessment methods for their safety programs found that traditional self-defense instruction had been creating false confidence that actually increased vulnerability to sophisticated predators who understood how to exploit civilian training limitations. Federal funding for civilian training reform included resources for instructor education that would enable existing martial arts teachers to develop the expertise necessary for providing genuine protective training rather than traditional techniques that were inadequate for realistic threats. The systematic changes in how civilian defensive capabilities were developed and assessed represented a fundamental shift from traditional martial arts instruction to reality-based preparation that addressed actual threats rather than stylized combat scenarios that bore little resemblance to genuine violence. Margaret's legacy extended beyond the immediate investigation to influence how federal agencies, military commands, and civilian institutions understood the relationship between training quality and systematic criminal exploitation of vulnerable populations. The 3-year follow-up study of reform training programs revealed significant reductions in successful attacks against individuals who had received instruction based on the new federal standards, demonstrating the effectiveness of Margaret's recommendations for protecting civilian populations from systematic predatory exploitation. The criminal network prosecutions resulted in permanent dismantling of organized exploitation operations while establishing legal precedents that would support future prosecutions of similar criminal enterprises. The federal investigations had created lasting protective measures for civilian training populations. Margaret's consultancy work evolved to include international assignments where her expertise in identifying and countering systematic criminal Exploitation of training programs was applied to protecting vulnerable populations in various countries facing similar predatory operations. The medical research programs established by Dr. Mitchell provided ongoing analysis of victim recovery patterns while developing improved treatment approaches for individuals whose protective training had been systematically exploited by organized criminal operations. The psychological research conducted on both victims and perpetrators revealed systematic patterns of exploitation that informed improved prevention strategies while providing evidence-based approaches for helping survivors recover from complex trauma. Federal law enforcement agencies incorporated Margaret's investigation methods into standard procedures for identifying organized criminal exploitation of civilian populations, with her assessment techniques becoming permanent components of task force operations throughout the country. The military support programs established through Colonel Harrison's coordination provided ongoing resources for civilian training reform while maintaining operational security around classified techniques that remained inappropriate for civilian instruction. The international cooperation frameworks that resulted from Margaret's work created lasting mechanisms for sharing information about systematic criminal exploitation of civilian training programs while coordinating law enforcement responses to organized predatory operations. Detective Santos's state task force became a model for other jurisdictions seeking to protect civilian training populations from systematic criminal exploitation, with Margaret's methods providing the foundation for effective law enforcement responses to organized predatory activities. Rivera's transformation of the Urban Defense Academy into a pilot program for federal training standards demonstrated how existing martial arts institutions could adapt their instruction to provide genuine protective capabilities while maintaining the community benefits of traditional martial arts training. The three women whose experience had initiated Margaret's investigation became national advocates for reformed civilian defensive training, their testimony before Congress and training organizations providing powerful evidence of the need for systematic improvements in how protective capabilities were developed and assessed. Federal oversight mechanisms established through the congressional hearings provided ongoing monitoring of civilian training quality while preventing future systematic exploitation of training vulnerabilities by organized criminal operations. The comprehensive nature of the reforms that resulted from Margaret's investigation created lasting improvements in how civilian populations developed genuine protective capabilities while avoiding the false confidence that had made them preferred targets for sophisticated predatory operations. Margaret's final assessment of the systematic changes that had resulted from her investigation revealed successful implementation of protective measures that addressed both immediate threats and long-term vulnerabilities that had been systematically exploited by organized criminal networks. The legacy of her work continued through federal standards that ensured civilian defensive training provided genuine protective capabilities, law enforcement procedures that identified systematic criminal exploitation of training programs, and victim support services that addressed the complex trauma of having protective efforts systematically defeated by professional predators. Years later, when new federal agents received training in identifying organized criminal exploitation of civilian populations, they studied Margaret's investigation as the definitive example of how professional expertise could be applied to protect vulnerable communities from systematic predatory operations. The transformation of civilian defensive training that had begun with Margaret's undercover evaluation of a single academy had evolved into comprehensive federal reforms that protected millions of individuals from systematic criminal exploitation, while ensuring that their protective training provided genuine capabilities, rather than false confidence that increased their vulnerability to sophisticated threats. Margaret returned to her quiet retirement with the satisfaction of knowing that her investigation had not only brought justice for the immediate victims, but had created lasting protective measures for civilian populations throughout the country. ensuring that future generations would receive training that actually prepared them for the realities of violence rather than stylized scenarios that bore no resemblance to genuine threats. The simple woman who had been humiliated in a knife-fighting class had revealed systematic criminal exploitation, operating at national scale while implementing comprehensive reforms that would protect civilian populations for generations to come, proving that genuine expertise combined with moral courage could create changes that extended far beyond individual justice to systematic protection for entire communities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.